Took forever to get all that makeup up. Ugh. Son of a bitch! Hi, welcome to Film Stash. My name's Douglas Campbell, and today we are talking about 1996's The Crow, City of Angels. After mechanic Ash Corvin, played by Vincent Perez, and his son witness a murder, they are captured and killed by drug lord Judah, played by Richard Brooks. A young artist named Sarah, played by Mia Kirshner, meets Ash and explains to him that he is now the Crow, a title held before by her friend Eric Draven. Ash sets out to get revenge by slaying Judah and his minions. Judah discovers the Crow's power and craves it for himself. Boy, that plot synopsis, it really over-elevates what happens in this movie. Like with the first Crow, the visuals of this city, it still is beautifully disgusting to look at. There are various different locations where it's lit nicely, but also there's a bunch of garbage around. There's a good sense that the world is lived in, which it fits well within the first film. I think they still translated it pretty well, that comic booky feel. The other idea that I kind of liked, now the execution, of course, that's a different story. Obviously, with the first film, your main star, Brandon Lee, died. So how are you really going to do a sequel? If you actually look at the comics, they do have a way of continuing the story without the main character that started it all. Eric Draven wasn't the only Crow. The symbol of the Crow is actually a moniker that got passed down. Different personas would take this and they would pursue their own justice. So the fact that the films, in order to continue the story, they took this on as well. Not that it's a huge positive, but it is an interesting way to keep the franchise going. Unfortunately, that's really all I have to say about the positives. It was really interesting to see the return of Sarah now as a young woman. She plays the role of a guide for this new Crow. She gets visions of him before eventually he rises out of the water like some sort of King Arthur folktale. And the fact that she's guiding him to sort of become this persona and exact his revenge, I thought it was a cool idea. It was a way to bridge the gap between the first film and the second film. But the problem ultimately is, she doesn't really have a personality. In the first film, you could say what you will about the child acting, even though I thought it was fine, but that little girl had a personality to her. She had some spunk. She was a nice kid, especially to Brandon Lee. You bought the humanity there, but this actress, and I don't think it's her fault, I think it's just the script writing, there really is nothing to her. She's there for a little bit, and then she's gone. And it's such a shame, because I feel like that would have made it certainly interesting just to continue the story on from these films. Of course, the other big problem that I'm kind of mixed about is Vincent Perez as Ash Corvin, aka the new Crow. He just isn't as compelling as Brandon Lee. You don't have to be as interesting as the previous iteration, but ultimately, I feel like when it comes to his acting, it was very uneven. Some of the scenes where he has to mope around and be depressed and mourn the loss of his son, some of it was done very well. Some of it was done very, very well. But then there are moments where he's being playful with the bad guys, or when he's killing henchmen, he gets excited and he really is feeling that rage, and it's just, he doesn't sell it. So the performance it's very uneven. And then there are these silent scenes, like how he digs his son out from that water and then he gives him a proper burial, that are very dramatic, but the problem is he doesn't speak. They're beautiful silent moments, and they're great. But then half the time whenever he's about to perform, I can't tell if it's gonna be as convincing or not, and that's kind of a major issue considering he becomes the main character. One of the things I criticized last time with my video was the use of the flashback in exploring Eric Draven's death. It was one of those things that I had an issue with it just because I wanted to get to know Eric Draven and Shelley more. I actually received a comment recently that highlighted a silver lining of sorts and why the limited time actually benefited the movie and the character. I will present the comment here. And I really enjoyed this comment because it did shed a light in a way that whenever I do explore the first film again someday on my own, I might see it differently. I might raise the score, and I thank you for sharing that with me. One of the interesting things that they highlighted to me is that because you get a limited screen time with those characters in their moment of happiness, it highlights just how tragic it is that these are lives lost and that gets cut off way too early. It's just gone, and it highlights the sadness even further. And I definitely think it's an interesting way of looking at that. It does lead to my critiques with this film, is that while the first film, those flashback sequences, even whether it was intentional or not, people could interpret and find a purpose with it that truly fit with the themes of the movie. With this film, however, it doesn't work as well, because at first, whenever I thought Sarah was going to be the lead, I thought surely with these flashback sequences, it makes sense that you're getting little glimpses into his death because he's not fully the lead. Sarah's the lead, and she's guiding him. Ultimately now, because Sarah backs out of the picture over time, and then he assumes the main lead status, it doesn't work as well because he now is a blank slate again. Like, you do know the basics of he's a mechanic, him and his son got brutally murdered, and now he's back for revenge. And it is tragic, but ultimately, I feel like in a comic book, this type of story where you get the little glimpses as presented in the first film, and you do it again and again, it sort of works because you're exploring these different arcs issue by issue. It's very serialized. And so if you present the information sort of in the same way, but the MO is slightly different, in film, it doesn't work as well because it just looks like you're pulling the same bag of tricks again and again. And apparently, it wasn't meant to be that way. This is thanks to the Weinsteins. Yay, Weinsteins! Yeah, you go, Weinsteins! Messing with another property. Thank you, Weinsteins. Yeah! Pretty much, they got involved with the editing of this film. Because they saw the success of the first movie, they pretty much wanted to emulate what that film had without truly understanding what people interpreted or what the filmmakers brought to it with the story. So they pretty much saw full scenes that were filmed of the death scene of Ash Corvin and his son, and they're like, hey, you know what? They had flashbacks in the first movie of the death. They had flashbacks, so let's get these fully formed scenes that kind of dive into the character and his son, and we'll just make them flashbacks. The problem there, they really didn't know much, but it's not as purposeful now, because ultimately, because you edited it like that, it just looks like you're pulling from the same bag of tricks, trying to emulate the first movie, but because of that, it just comes out dull and bland. It doesn't work as well. It just feels like a cheap imitation because that's what the first film did. You know what that means? It's time for intermission. And today's popcorn, it's a Smart Food Flamin' Hot White Cheddar Popcorn. So this one's kind of interesting. Is there really a theme connecting it to it? Not really. Just dive right into this. Ooh, man. It has an interesting aroma, I'll say that. That's the look of no artificial flavors and gluten-freeness right there. Cheers. Now let's try it for real. Okay. You definitely taste the white cheddar taste at first, and that's really good. a little bit of a kick after. Now, is it as hot as the ghost pepper popcorn, or is it as prominent as the dill pickle popcorn? No, but you do get a little bit of a burn in the back of your throat after at least 5 seconds. All things considered though, that's not bad. I would give that a 9 out of 10. That is really delicious. Oh. The biggest problem with this movie, it's the writing. Not just overall, but with the characters. Which is ironic because the writer of this movie is David S. Goyer. Now, he actually wrote movies that I like. He wrote the Dark Knight trilogy. He wrote the Blade trilogy. He even wrote some of the DCEU movies, but that's a whole other thing. He has written good superhero films before. The problem with this movie, that the first film, despite some of the personal flaws I saw in it, they truly captured the humanity of our three main leads. Because in a world of darkness that the first film represented, three shining beacons that you could see, it was Brandon Lee as the Crow, it was Sarah, and it was Ernie Hudson's character. Those characters were written well enough that they brought a certain brightness and warmth and humanity to them, despite the fact that the world was just falling to shit around them. But the problem ultimately with this film is when you don't have any of that, it just doesn't work. I just don't care. I didn't care about the new Crow. I didn't care about Sarah. It falls apart so fast. So if I don't care enough about the characters or see their humanity, it's just bland and gothic without a purpose. It's just boring. Alright, but that's enough of the characters for now. Let's just talk about the filmmaking in general for a second. The first film, they utilize some shaky cam, some blurry motion, and they do it for some of the establishing shots, and it works fine. But this film, I feel like the shaky cam and the blurriness kind of gets dialed up to an 11 a little bit with some of these establishing shots of the club scenes. Because they have these club scenes just to kind of show the seediness of the city and how things are kind of going downhill and how sin is everywhere. And while some of it just feels a little like you're layering on this too long just to be exploitative, but the shaky cam I think annoyed me way more, just because going through it and seeing that blurry but also shaky cam at the same time, it gave me a headache to look at. It wasn't fun to look at. I was just getting a headache watching the thing. Now, while I'm talking about the griminess of the film, the gross city look and the emo-ness, it's also taken up significantly, which, considering the atmosphere of what this film is, it could work for some viewers, but my thing is, it just sometimes comes off unnecessarily over the top and kind of gross looking also. Playing it just so people can ogle at the weird stuff in the background or in the foreground. I guess this was like a sign of the 90s and whatnot, and how it's like, oh, we're gonna make this crazy for viewers, but it just kind of feels a little exploitative, and it's just odd to look at. They explored the sin of the city. This film also uses, with the main villain, Judah, iconography from the occult and dark magic and whatnot. And it also uses religious imagery from the Day of the Dead. And I feel like with how they use both of these things with Judah and with the overall tone of the city and what they're celebrating, it sometimes comes off as very pretentious to me. The villain kind of trying to tote himself around as a god, surrounding himself with magic and whatnot. It's kind of weird. And then also, in terms of the Day of the Dead stuff, they don't really utilize it to full effect other than the death of the one henchman. Most of the time, it just comes off as weird and pretentious. Like, there isn't fully a point to it. And then when you're surrounded by more goofy-ass Batman villains running around, it's just weird. This one here, this point I'm bringing up, it's kind of nitpicky, but it also kind of goes into my point of how they just did not know how to pace the story out. The main villain, Judah, like what I mentioned earlier, he surrounds himself with the occult and dark magic, and so some of his members, they know this stuff. It works better than how in the first movie somehow the woman henchman knew that the crow was the weakness. Judah, he ends up killing this crow's crow and drinks its blood to get its power. And he actually gets the power. That could have been an actual interesting conflict in the movie. At the very least, you could have had this happen in the middle of the movie. That way, they would have had to get creative in trying to defeat the villain. How do you defeat a villain that's basically the crow, but now the crow is mortal? Just as soon as Judah gets the power, he's just as easily defeated because they get the misery from other crows and shoot it through him. And that's it. They make a conflict that could have been the last half of your movie for a villain that I think was played fine by that actor. He didn't really bring anything special, but it could have been an interesting villain. It could have been really interesting, but then nothing happens. Nothing comes of it. It's just very anticlimactic. Especially considering you killed a crow's crow, but now he's just a regular guy. How is he going to defeat this otherworldly entity? You know, bullshit. That's how. Symbolically, I get it because now he's feeling all the misery and whatnot, but like with the first film, how they pulled that weakness out from their asses, they pulled this out from their asses, and it just doesn't work either. I can at least forgive with the first film because it's a better overall film, but this one, it's mostly boring. So then you pulled that out from what could have been an interesting climax, and then nothing. In the end, honestly, like, I've heard the reputation this film had. I try to go in with an open mind, and I'm excited to check out the other films, and I hope there's something I can get from it. But this is a rough start. I hope things get at least a little better. This is a 4.5 out of 10 for me. So, for this week's recommendation, obviously, David Goyer was trying to go with a certain dark, emo-esque, Matrixy atmosphere. If you want to go for a way in which he sort of conveys this tone, but in a fun, fast-paced, action-packed way, I would actually recommend the original Blade film starring Wesley Snipes. If you've seen Deadpool and Wolverine, you've got a little hint of this character. He is so cool in the schlockiest 90s cheesy action way. He is so cool. And obviously the atmosphere in terms of the emo goth clubs with these vampires, I think it works so much better in that film there too, capturing that griminess of the city. Honestly, it's fun. I really would check it out. Well, that's all the time we have for today here at Film Stash. My name's Douglas Campbell, and if you excuse me, I gotta add to the stash.